Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are venturing north of the border into the forgotten corners of Canada where isolation breeds secrets and small communities harbor darkness that would make even the bravest souls question their faith in humanity. 7 tales await us from across the vast Canadian wilderness, each one more disturbing than the last, each one pulled from the shadows of towns so remote that screams echo unanswered and sins go unpunished for decades. From the mining settlements of Ontario to the coastal villages of British Columbia, we will uncover stories that prove sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings lurking in the woods, but the people living right next door. These are not mere campfire stories or urban legends passed down through generations, but real accounts from real people who lived through experiences that forever changed their understanding of evil itself. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Canadian wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Detective Kendrix Walsh, and in my 15 years working small-town cases across northern Ontario, I thought I had seen everything: domestic disputes and logging camps, bar fights that turned deadly, missing persons who wandered off into the wilderness never to return. But that was all before the Jaelyn Morrison case landed on my desk in the bitter cold January of 2022. What I discovered during that investigation changed not only how I view human trafficking, but how these predators operate in the most remote communities where nobody is watching and nobody asks questions. I had been stationed in Timmins for 3 years when the call came in. It was a Tuesday morning, and the temperature outside was hovering around minus 35 Celsius, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache just breathing the air. The call came from Martha Henley, the owner of Henley's All-Night Diner, a greasy spoon restaurant that served truckers and mine workers 24 hours a day. Martha was frantic on the phone. She kept repeating that Jaelyn had never missed a shift, not once in the 2 years she had been working there. Jaelyn Morrison was 19 years old, a local girl who had graduated from O'Gorman High School the year before. She lived with her grandmother in a small house on the outskirts of town, and she had been saving up money from her waitressing job to attend nursing school in Sudbury. By all accounts, she was responsible, reliable, and had her whole future mapped out ahead of her. She was supposed to work the overnight shift that Monday, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., but she never showed up. When I arrived at the diner, Martha was pacing behind the counter, her hand shaking as she poured coffee for the handful of customers who had wandered in for breakfast. She was a woman in her 60s who had run that diner for over 20 years, and she knew the routines of every regular customer and every employee like clockwork. Martha told me that Jaelyn had worked her usual Sunday night shift without any problems. She had seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. She had clocked out at 7 a.m. Monday morning, said goodbye, and walked out the front door like she always did. That was the last time anyone saw her. I drove straight to Jaelyn's grandmother's house, a small bungalow with peeling paint and a snow-covered garden that had not been tended to in years. Eleanor Morrison was 82 years old and had raised Jaelyn since she was 7, after Jaelyn's mother died in a car accident. Eleanor was sitting in her living room when I knocked, wrapped in a thick blanket and clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands. She told me that Jaelyn had come home Monday morning after work, eaten some breakfast, and gone to bed around 9 a.m. like she always did after working the night shift. Eleanor had woken up Monday evening around 6 p.m. and had expected to find Jaelyn getting ready for work, but Jaelyn's bed was empty and her work uniform was still hanging in the closet. Her purse was gone, along with her winter coat and boots, but everything else was exactly as she had left it. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall beside her bed. Her laptop was open on her desk, with a half-finished nursing school application still on the screen. I spent the next 2 days canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing everyone who might have seen Jaelyn. Timmins is not a large town, and word travels fast when someone goes missing, but nobody had seen her leave the house Monday evening. Nobody had seen her walking along the roads. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. On Thursday morning, I decided to review the security footage from the diner. Martha had mentioned that they had recently installed a new camera system after a series of break-ins at businesses around town. The cameras covered the parking lot, the front entrance, and the interior of the restaurant. I spent hours going through the footage from Sunday night and Monday morning, watching Jaelyn serve customers, clean tables, and go about her normal routine. But it was the footage from Monday evening that changed everything. At 8:47 p.m. Monday night, more than 12 hours after Jaelyn had supposedly gone home and gone to bed, the security camera clearly showed her walking through the front door of the diner. She was not wearing her work uniform. Instead, she was dressed in jeans and a heavy winter coat, and she looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. She approached the counter where Martha was working and spoke to her for approximately 2 minutes. Then she turned around and walked back toward the entrance, but she was not alone. A man had been sitting in one of the corner booths, partially obscured by shadows, and he stood up and followed her to the door. He was tall, probably in his 40s, with dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a heavy winter jacket and work boots, the kind of clothes that would blend in perfectly among the truckers and construction workers who frequented the diner. The footage showed him placing his hand on Jaelyn's back as they walked outside together. I immediately called Martha and asked her about the Monday evening visit. At first, she seemed confused, saying that Jaelyn had not been scheduled to work that night and had not come in. But when I pressed her about it, her voice became hesitant. Finally, she admitted that Jaelyn had come in around 8:30 p.m., but she had seemed upset about something. Jaelyn had asked if she could use the phone because her cell phone was dead, and she needed to call someone. Martha had let her use the phone behind the counter, and afterward Jaelyn had thanked her and left. Martha claimed she had not noticed the man who followed Jaelyn out, but something in her voice told me she was not telling the whole truth. I pulled the security footage from several businesses along the main road, leading out of town, hoping to track the direction Jaelyn and the unknown man had gone. Most of the cameras were old and the footage was grainy, but I managed to piece together their route. They had walked together to a dark-colored pickup truck parked behind the Tim Hortons, 2 blocks away from the diner. The license plate was not visible in any of the footage, and the truck was a common make and model that could belong to any one of hundreds of people in the area. That was where the trail went cold. I contacted the Ontario Provincial Police and requested assistance with what was now clearly a potential abduction case. Detective Sarah Chen from the OPP's Human Trafficking Unit arrived in Timmins 2 days later, and she brought with her a different perspective on what might have happened to Jaelyn Morrison. Detective Chen explained that Northern Ontario had become a corridor for human trafficking operations, precisely because of its remote location and transient population. Mining companies, logging operations, and trucking routes brought in workers from all over the country, many of whom had no permanent address and no family connections in the area. It was the perfect environment for criminals to operate without attracting attention from law enforcement. She told me that trafficking rings often used local businesses as fronts for their operations. Restaurants, motels, and truck stops provided convenient meeting places where victims could be transferred from one handler to another without arousing suspicion. The perpetrators would often spend weeks or months building relationships with potential victims, gaining their trust before making their move. We returned to the diner and questioned Martha more thoroughly. This time, Detective Chen took the lead, and her approach was more direct. She explained to Martha that we believed Jaelyn had been trafficked, and that anyone who had helped facilitate the crime could face serious criminal charges. She also explained that Martha might be in danger herself if she had witnessed something that could identify the perpetrators. That was when Martha finally broke down and told us the truth. The man who had followed Jaelyn out of the diner was not a stranger. His name was Rick Dalton, and he had been coming to the diner regularly for about 6 months. He claimed to work in construction, traveling between job sites across northern Ontario. He was friendly, polite, and he always left generous tips. He had gradually started conversations with Jaelyn, asking about her plans for nursing school and offering to help her with tuition costs. Martha said that Rick had told Jaelyn he knew people who could get her a much better paying job than waitressing, working as a hostess at high-end restaurants in Toronto and Montreal. The work would pay enough that she could save up for school much faster than she could working at the diner. He had given her his phone number and told her to call him if she was interested. On Monday evening, Jaelyn had come to the diner upset because she had called Rick, but her grandmother's phone was not working properly. She needed to use the diner's phone to call him back because she had decided to accept his job offer. She was supposed to meet him that night to discuss the details. Martha said she had a bad feeling about the whole situation, but she had not wanted to interfere in Jaelyn's decisions. She was young and eager to improve her circumstances, and Martha understood that the opportunities for good-paying work in Timmins were limited. Armed with Rick Dalton's name, Detective Chen was able to access databases that I did not have clearance for. Within hours, we discovered that Rick Dalton was an alias. The man's real name was Richard Dalkowski, and he had been arrested twice in Manitoba on charges related to human trafficking, though both cases had been dropped due to lack of evidence. He had known associates in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia who were suspected of involvement in trafficking operations. More importantly, Detective Chen's contacts were able to trace cell phone records that showed Rick had been in regular contact with several phone numbers registered to addresses in Toronto and Montreal. The pattern of calls suggested that he was coordinating with other members of a trafficking network, reporting on potential victims and arranging transfers. We now had enough evidence to obtain search warrants and begin a coordinated operation with law enforcement agencies in multiple provinces. But time was critical. Detective Chen explained that trafficking victims were usually moved quickly and frequently to prevent them from forming connections or learning enough about their location to escape. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Rick's phone contacts led us to a trucking company based in Sudbury that was suspected of transporting trafficking victims along Highway 11 between Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario cities. When OPP officers executed a search warrant on the company's offices, they found detailed logs of routes, pickup points, and drop-off locations. One of those locations was an abandoned mining facility 30 kilometers outside of Timmins. The mine had been closed for over a decade, but the underground tunnels were still intact. Local authorities had sealed most of the entrances years ago, but Detective Chen suspected that traffickers might have found ways to access the underground areas where victims could be held without any possibility of being seen or heard. On a Friday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Jaelyn had first gone missing, a joint task force of OPP officers, RCMP personnel, and local emergency responders descended on the abandoned mine site. They brought specialized equipment for underground rescue operations and thermal imaging devices that could detect human body heat through rock and concrete. It took nearly 6 hours of searching, but they found her. Jaelyn was alive, but barely conscious, in a makeshift holding area deep underground. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from hypothermia. But she was breathing. She had been chained to a support beam in what had once been an equipment storage room. There was evidence that other people had been held in the same location recently. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her condition before transporting her to the hospital in Timmins. For the first 48 hours, doctors were not certain she would survive. But Jaelyn Morrison was stronger than anyone realized. When she was finally able to speak, she told us that Rick had driven her to what he claimed was a job interview at a restaurant in Sudbury. But instead of stopping at a restaurant, he had brought her to an isolated house where 3 other men were waiting. They had drugged her, and when she woke up, she was in the underground room at the mine site. She had been told that she was going to be transported to Toronto, where she would be forced to work in the sex trade until she had paid off a debt that they claimed she owed for room, board, and transportation costs. The debt was designed to be impossible to repay, ensuring that she would remain trapped indefinitely. Rick and 2 of his associates were arrested and charged with human trafficking, forcible confinement, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that they had been operating in northern Ontario for at least 2 years, targeting young women from small towns who were looking for opportunities to improve their economic situations. During the trial, we learned that Jaelyn had not been their only victim. The network had successfully trafficked at least 12 other young women from communities across northern Ontario and Manitoba. Most of those victims were never found. Jaelyn Morrison recovered from her physical injuries, but the psychological trauma of her experience will stay with her for the rest of her life. She was never able to attend nursing school as she had planned. The trust that had been broken could never be fully repaired. But she survived, and her case helped law enforcement agencies across Canada better understand how these trafficking networks operate in remote communities. As for Rick Dalton, or Richard Dalkowski, he was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. But Detective Chen warned me that trafficking networks are like hydras. Cut off one head, and 2 more appear to take its place. The demand for victims ensures that there will always be predators ready to exploit the vulnerable, especially in isolated communities where they can operate in shadows. The Jaelyn Morrison case taught me that evil does not always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it looks like a friendly customer who leaves generous tips and asks polite questions about your future plans. Sometimes it wears a helpful smile and offers opportunities that seem too good to be true. And sometimes it operates in plain sight, in the places where we should feel safest, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I am Jaelyn Kowalski, 3rd-generation farmer, and what happened on our property during the winter of 2019 made me question everything I thought I knew about the land my family has worked for 60 years. My grandfather bought this 800-acre farm outside Dawson Creek, British Columbia back in 1959, when the oil boom was just beginning and land was still cheap. My father expanded the operation in the 80s, and when I inherited it in 2015, I thought I understood every hill, every creek, every stand of trees on the property better than I understood my own reflection. I was wrong. The first sign something was not right came in late November, just after the first heavy snowfall of the season. I'd gone out early that morning to check on the cattle in the north pasture the way I did every morning during winter months. The temperature had dropped to -20 overnight, and I wanted to make sure the water troughs had not frozen solid. It was still dark when I reached the pasture, with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. What I found there defied every bit of farming experience I had accumulated over 34 years of life. 7 of my Black Angus cattle were dead, not sick, not injured, but completely dead, lying in the snow in what appeared to be a perfect circle around the water trough. Each animal was positioned exactly the same way, lying on their left side with their heads pointing toward the center of the circle and their legs extended straight out from their bodies. There were no signs of struggle, no blood in the snow, no tracks from predators or vehicles. I had raised cattle my entire adult life, and I had seen animals die from disease, injury, predator attacks, and severe weather, but I had never seen anything like this. Healthy adult cattle weighing over 1,000 pounds each do not simply lie down in geometric patterns and die simultaneously for no apparent reason. I called our veterinarian, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had been treating our animals for over a decade. She arrived within an hour, and I could see the confusion in her face as she examined the carcasses. She took tissue samples, photographed the scene, and checked the remaining cattle for signs of illness or poisoning. All of the other animals appeared to be in perfect health. Dr. Martinez sent the tissue samples to a laboratory in Calgary for analysis. The results came back 2 weeks later, and they provided no answers. No traces of poison, no evidence of disease, No indication of what might have caused the deaths. According to every test the laboratory could perform, the cattle had simply stopped living. But that was only the beginning. 3 nights later, my wife Sarah woke me around 2 in the morning, shaking my shoulder and whispering that there were lights in the north pasture. I looked out our bedroom window, and sure enough, there were strange lights moving slowly across the field where I had found the dead cattle. They were not the headlights of a vehicle or the beam of a flashlight. These lights had a pale blue-white glow, and they seemed to hover about 3 feet above the ground, moving in random patterns like they were searching for something. Where I grabbed my rifle and my heaviest winter coat and went outside to investigate. Sarah begged me not to go alone, but I told her to stay in the house with our 2 children and call the RCMP if I was not back within an hour. The temperature outside was brutal, probably close to -30, and the wind was cutting across the open fields like a knife. As I walked toward the north pasture, the lights suddenly stopped moving and began to fade. By the time I reached the fence line, they had disappeared completely. But something else was wrong with the scene. The snow in the pasture was not smooth like it should have been after days of wind. Instead, there were patterns pressed into the snow, geometric shapes that looked almost like symbols, or writing in a language I did not recognize. The patterns covered an area about 50 feet in diameter, centered on the spot where I had found the dead cattle. The impressions in the snow were perfectly formed, with clean edges and uniform depth. Whatever had created them had to have been heavy enough to compress the snow, but I could not find any tracks leading to or away from the area. I took photographs with my phone and returned to the house, but I did not sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I drove back out to the pasture to examine the patterns in daylight, but the snow had been swept clean by the wind, and there was no trace of the strange symbols. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appeared 4 more times, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always in the same general area. Each time I tried to get close enough to see what was causing them, but they would vanish as soon as I approached. Sarah started sleeping poorly, jumping at every sound outside and insisting that something was watching the house from the tree line that bordered our property to the east. Then, on the night of December 15th, everything changed. I was awakened not by Sarah, but by a sound I had never heard before. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the barn, and it was unlike anything I could describe. Imagine the sound of wind blowing through a tunnel, but with an underlying rhythm like a heartbeat, and occasional sharp notes that sounded almost like screaming. The sound was so unsettling that it made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing in our yard, about 30 feet from the house. The figure was tall, probably close to 7 feet, and unnaturally thin. Even at a distance and in the darkness, I could tell that its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, and its head seemed too small for its body. It was facing the house, and although I could not make out any details of its face, I had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking directly at me. The figure stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then it turned and began walking toward the tree line with a strange, shambling gait that looked more like it was floating just above the ground than actually taking steps. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and ran outside, shouting at the figure to stop and identify itself. But by the time I reached the spot where it had been standing, it had vanished into the trees. I followed its tracks in the snow, but after about 20 feet, the tracks simply ended. There were no prints leading deeper into the woods, no broken branches, no sign of where the figure might have gone. But there was something else in the snow where the tracks ended. It was the carcass of a deer, but like the cattle, it showed no signs of injury or disease. The deer was lying on its side in the same position as the dead cattle had been, with its head pointing toward the house and its legs extended straight out from its body. But this deer had been dead for much longer than the few minutes since I'd seen the figure. The carcass was frozen solid and partially covered with snow, indicating it had been there for days. The next morning, I called the RCMP detachment in Dawson Creek and reported the incidents. Constable David Thompson arrived that afternoon to take a statement and examine the evidence. He was professional and thorough, but I could tell he was skeptical about my account of the tall figure and the strange lights. However, his attitude changed when I showed him the deer carcass and the photographs I had taken of the dead cattle. Constable Thompson had grown up in the area and had hunting and farming experience. He knew that the positioning of the animals was not natural, and he could not explain how 7 healthy cattle could die simultaneously without any apparent cause. He suggested that I contact Dr. James Whitehorse, an elder from the local Danezaw First Nation, who might have traditional knowledge that could help explain what was happening on my land. Constable Thompson explained that the Danezaw people had lived in the Peace River region for thousands of years, and they had knowledge of the land that went back generations before European settlement. I was skeptical about seeking help from traditional indigenous sources, but I was desperate enough to try anything. Dr. Whitehorse agreed to meet with me the following day, and when I described the events on my property, his expression grew increasingly serious. He told me that my farm was located on land that the Danezaw people considered to be spiritually significant. According to their oral traditions, the area had once been the site of a winter camp where a terrible tragedy had occurred sometime in the distant past. A group of families had been trapped there during an especially harsh winter, and they had all starved to death when game became scarce and their food stores ran out. Dr. Whitehorse explained that in Danezaw tradition, people who died of starvation under such circumstances could become Wendigo, cannibalistic spirits that were forever hungry and could never find peace. These spirits were said to roam the land where they died, searching for sustenance and growing stronger with each life they took. He told me that the geometric patterns I had seen in the snow were consistent with traditional descriptions of Wendigo markings, and that the tall, unnaturally thin figure I had encountered matched traditional descriptions of these spirits. The fact that animals were dying without apparent cause suggested that the Wendigo was feeding on their life force, growing stronger and bolder with each kill. Dr. Whitehorse warned me that if the Wendigo was indeed active on my land, it would not be satisfied with taking only animal lives indefinitely. As it grew stronger, it would begin to target human beings, starting with those who lived closest to its territory. He offered to perform a traditional cleansing ceremony on my property, but he cautioned that such ceremonies were not always successful, especially if the Wendigo had already become very powerful. He also warned me that the ceremony might anger the spirit and cause it to become more aggressive before it was banished. I was torn between my rational skepticism and my growing fear for my family's safety. The scientific part of my mind rejected the idea of supernatural spirits, but I could not explain what was happening on my property through any conventional means, and the incidents were becoming more frequent and more disturbing. The decision was made for me 2 nights later. Sarah woke me around 3 a.m., frantically shaking me and pointing toward our children's bedroom. She whispered that she had heard someone walking around upstairs in the hallway outside the kids' rooms, but both of our children were sound sleepers, and neither of them was in the habit of getting up in the middle of the night. I grabbed my rifle and crept upstairs as quietly as I could. The hallway was dark, but I could see that both children's bedroom doors were open. They were both supposed to be closed. I looked into my daughter Emma's room first, and she was sleeping peacefully in her bed, undisturbed. But when I looked into my son Tyler's room, my blood ran cold. Tyler was sitting up in his bed, wide awake, staring at his bedroom window. He was not moving, not blinking, just staring with an expression I had never seen on his 8-year-old face before. When I whispered his name, he did not respond or even acknowledge my presence. I followed his gaze to the window, and there, standing outside in our backyard, was the tall figure I had seen before. But this time it was much closer, only about 10 feet from the house, and I could see more details. Its skin was grayish white, stretched tight over bones that seemed to be jutting out at unnatural angles. Its face was gaunt and hollow, with sunken cheeks, and eyes that glowed with a pale blue light. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp. The figure was looking directly at Tyler, and Tyler was looking back, neither of them moving or making any sound. I raised my rifle and aimed it at the figure, but before I could fire, it opened its mouth wider and let out a sound that was part shriek, part growl, and part something I cannot even describe. The sound was so loud and so alien that it seemed to vibrate through my bones. Tyler immediately fell back onto his bed, unconscious, and the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I ran to Tyler and checked his pulse and breathing. He was alive, but his skin was cold to the touch, and I could not wake him up no matter how hard I tried. Sarah called for an ambulance, and we rushed him to the hospital in Dawson Creek. The doctors could not find anything wrong with Tyler. His vital signs were normal, his blood tests came back clean, and there were no signs of injury or illness. But he remained unconscious for 3 days, and when he finally woke up, he had no memory of what had happened that night. However, something had changed in Tyler. He had lost weight during those 3 days, even though he had been receiving IV nutrition at the hospital. His hair had developed streaks of gray that had not been there before, and his eyes, which had always been brown like mine, now had flecks of pale blue in them. That was when I knew that Dr. Whitehorse had been right. Whatever was on my land was not natural, and it was getting stronger. I called Dr. Whitehorse the next day and agreed to the traditional cleansing ceremony. He arrived the following evening with 2 other elders from his community, and they spent the entire night performing rituals around my property. They burned sage and sweetgrass, sang traditional songs, and conducted ceremonies in the Dainza language that I could not understand. The ceremony seemed to work. The strange lights never appeared again, and I never saw the tall figure after that night. The remaining cattle stayed healthy, and no more animals died under mysterious circumstances. But the peace came at a cost. Tyler never fully recovered from his encounter with the Wendigo. He grew up to be a quiet, withdrawn child who avoided spending time outdoors and refused to talk about what had happened that winter. And sometimes, when the light hit his eyes just right, I could still see those flecks of pale blue that served as a permanent reminder of the night something inhuman had tried to claim my son's soul. I still work the land that has been in my family for 3 generations, but I no longer take its history for granted. There are forces in this world that science cannot explain and that skepticism cannot defeat. And sometimes, the only way to protect the people you love is to acknowledge that there are things beyond your understanding and seek help from those who carry the wisdom of generations. My name is Indiana Santos, and I am a professional sound engineer who moved to Lillooet, British Columbia in the spring of 2021 for the peace and quiet. After spending 15 years working in recording studios in Vancouver, mixing albums for rock bands and scoring soundtracks for television shows, I was completely burned out on the noise and chaos of city life. What I recorded instead during my first year in this tiny mountain town will haunt me for the rest of my life. Lillooet sits in the Fraser Canyon, about 250 kilometers northeast of Vancouver, and it is one of those places where the mountains seem to swallow sound rather than echo it. The town has a population of just over 2,000 people, and most of them have lived there for generations. It was exactly the kind of isolated, quiet environment I needed to reset my career and maybe start working on some personal projects I had been putting off for years. I bought a small house on the outskirts of town, right where the residential area gives way to the wilderness that stretches north toward the Caribou Mountains. The house came with a detached garage that was perfect for converting into a home recording studio. I spent my first 3 months there installing professional-grade acoustic insulation, setting up my mixing board and monitors, and calibrating my equipment to capture the purest possible sound quality. By August, my studio was operational, and I was ready to begin work on an ambient music album that would incorporate natural sounds from the British Columbia wilderness. My plan was to record hours of environmental audio during different seasons and weather conditions, then layer those recordings with synthesized music to create something that would capture the feeling of being alone in the mountains. I started by setting up remote recording equipment in various locations around my property and the surrounding forest. I had several high-end field recorders that could operate for weeks on battery power, capturing 24 hours of audio per day with minimal human intervention. I positioned them near Jaelyn Creek, which ran behind my property, in clearings where I thought I might capture interesting bird songs or wind patterns, and in deeper parts of the forest where I hoped to record the subtle sounds of wildlife moving through the underbrush. The first few weeks of recordings were exactly what I had expected. Hours of flowing water, wind through pine trees, the occasional call of a loon, or the rustle of small animals moving through the forest. I was getting beautiful, clean audio that would work perfectly for the ambient project I had in mind. But in early September, something changed. I was reviewing the previous night's recordings from the device I had positioned near Jaelyn Creek when I noticed something unusual in the audio file. It was around 3:27 in the morning, during what should have been the quietest part of the night, when I heard what sounded like human voices having a conversation about 50 feet away from the microphone. At first, I assumed it was late-night hikers, or maybe local teenagers who had been drinking by the creek. But as I listened more carefully with my professional headphones, I realized that the voices were not speaking English. In fact, they were not speaking any language I could identify, and I had worked with musicians and vocalists from dozens of different countries over the years. The conversation lasted for approximately 7 minutes, and it involved at least 3 distinct voices, all of them male. The tone was serious, almost formal, like they were discussing something important. But the language itself was completely foreign to me. The phonetic patterns did not match any European, Asian, or indigenous languages I had ever heard, and some of the sounds seemed to involve vocal techniques that I was not sure human throats could produce. I made a digital copy of the audio segment and played it for several people in town, hoping someone might recognize the language or at least have an explanation for who might have been out by the creek in the middle of the night. But nobody I spoke with had any idea what the voices were saying or where they might have come from. I decided to continue monitoring the recordings more carefully, and over the next 2 weeks, I captured similar conversations on 3 more occasions. Each time, the voices appeared between 2 and 4 a.m., always near the creek, and always speaking in the same unidentifiable language. The conversations were becoming longer and more frequent, and I was beginning to worry that my property was being used for some kind of illegal activity. But then I recorded something that made me question whether the voices were human at all. On the night of September 23rd, my equipment captured what sounded like the same 3 voices having another conversation near the creek. But this time, one of the voices began describing events that I recognized. In the strange, impossible language, the voice was providing what sounded like a detailed account of my daily activities from the previous week. I know this sounds insane, but I am certain that the voice was talking about me. It described how I had driven into town on Monday to buy groceries, mentioning specific items I had purchased and the order in which I had visited different stores. It described the phone conversation I had with my former business partner in Vancouver on Tuesday evening, including details that no one else could have known unless they had been listening to both sides of the call. Most disturbing of all, the voice described private moments inside my house that no outside observer could have witnessed. It knew that I had been having trouble sleeping and had been taking melatonin tablets before bed. It knew that I had been working on a piece of music that incorporated recordings of thunderstorms. It somehow knew intimate details about my life that I had not shared with anyone. The other 2 voices responded to this information with what sounded like approval and encouragement, as if they were receiving a report from someone who had been assigned to watch me. I started staying up late and keeping watch on the creek area, hoping to catch whoever was conducting surveillance on my property. But I never saw anyone, and the voices never appeared when I was actively listening for them. They only showed up on the recordings when I was asleep in my house, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening outside. Then, in early October, the recordings took an even more disturbing turn. The voices began describing events that had not happened yet, but which came true within days of being recorded. On October 5th, I recorded a conversation in which one of the voices described a car accident that would occur on Highway 99, just south of Lillooet, involving a blue pickup truck and a logging truck. The voice provided specific details about the time of day, the weather conditions, and the injuries that would result from the crash. 3 days later, exactly as described in the recording, a blue pickup truck collided with a logging truck on Highway 99 during an afternoon rainstorm. The driver of the pickup truck suffered the exact injuries that had been predicted in the mysterious conversation, and the accident occurred at precisely the time that had been mentioned. I contacted the RCMP detachment in Lillooet and tried to explain what I had recorded, but I could tell that Constable Michael Peterson thought I was either mentally unstable or trying to perpetrate some kind of hoax. He listened to the audio files I played for him, but he dismissed them as coincidence or suggested that I might have misunderstood what the voices were actually saying. But I kept recording, and the predictions kept coming true. On October 12th, the voices described a house fire that would occur on First Avenue, providing details about which room the fire would start in and how the occupants would escape. 2 days later, the Henderson family's house on First Avenue caught fire in their kitchen, exactly as the voices had predicted, and the family escaped through their bedroom window, just as the recording had described. On October 19th, the voices predicted that Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who ran the local library, would fall and break her hip while walking her dog near the community center. They specified that it would happen on a Tuesday morning around 9:30 a.m., that her dog would run home to alert her daughter, and that she would be hospitalized for 6 weeks. The following Tuesday, Margaret Chen fell and broke her hip while walking her dog near the community center at 9:28 a.m. Her dog ran home and led her daughter back to where Margaret was lying injured. She was hospitalized for exactly 6 weeks. I was terrified, but I was also fascinated. From a scientific perspective, as a sound engineer, I was trained to analyze audio objectively and identify any signs of manipulation or fakery. But these recordings were completely authentic. The voices were being captured live, in real time, with no evidence of digital editing or post-production enhancement. I began researching similar phenomena online and discovered that there have been reports throughout history of people recording mysterious voices that seem to possess knowledge of future events. These cases are often dismissed as hoaxes or psychological delusions, but the technical quality of my recordings made it impossible for me to doubt what I was hearing. I also learned that Lillooet sits in an area that has significant geological and electromagnetic properties. The town is located at the confluence of two major river systems surrounded by mountains that contain high concentrations of quartz and other crystalline minerals. Some researchers have theorized that certain geographical locations can act as natural amplifiers for paranormal phenomena, though mainstream science rejects these theories. In late October, I made a decision that would change the entire nature of my situation. Instead of just passively recording the voices, I decided to try to communicate with them directly. I waited until 2 a.m. on October 28th, then went out to the creek with a portable recorder and a megaphone I had borrowed from the local fire department. I positioned myself near the spot where the voices usually appeared and began speaking in English, asking who they were and how they were able to predict future events. At first, there was no response, but after about 10 minutes of me speaking into the darkness, I heard one of the familiar voices respond from somewhere in the forest behind me. The voice was using the same strange language as always, but its tone was different. Instead of the formal, conversational quality I had heard before, this voice sounded surprised and almost alarmed. The voice called out several times, and I could hear the other two voices responding from different locations around me. They were moving through the forest, getting closer to my position, and their tone was becoming increasingly agitated. Then, something impossible happened. One of the voices began speaking in perfect English. "You should not be here," the voice said from somewhere in the trees to my left. "You should not be listening." I asked who they were and how they knew about future events, but the voice ignored my questions. "The recordings will stop now," it said. "You will forget what you have heard. You will leave this place." I demanded to know what gave them the right to spy on me and make threats, but the voice cut me off. "We are not what you think we are," it said. "We are not from when you think we are. The sounds you have been hearing are echoes from tomorrow, reflections of conversations that have not yet occurred in your timeline." The voice explained that certain locations, under specific conditions, can create temporal anomalies that allow sound waves to travel backward through time. What I had been recording were conversations that would take place in the future, somehow being transmitted to the present through natural electromagnetic phenomena unique to the Fraser Canyon region. "But you have disrupted the process," the voice continued. "By becoming aware of the echoes, you have created a paradox that threatens the integrity of the timeline itself. The predictions have been coming true because you have been unconsciously influencing events to match what you heard in the recordings." I asked why they were telling me this, and the voice's response chilled me to the bone. "Because if you continue to listen and to record, the paradox will worsen. Events will begin to change in ways that cannot be corrected. People will die who were meant to live. Others will live who were meant to die. The future itself will become unstable." The voice told me that I had 48 hours to destroy all of my recordings and leave Lillooet permanently. If I did not comply, they would take measures to ensure that the temporal disruption was contained, regardless of the consequences to me. I wanted to ask more questions, but all three voices fell silent, and I could hear them moving away through the forest until their footsteps faded completely. I returned to my house and spent the rest of the night reviewing every recording I had made since moving to Lillooet. In the context of what the voice had told me, I could see patterns I hadn't noticed before. The predictions were not just coming true, they were coming true because I had heard them and had unconsciously acted in ways that made them inevitable. When I learned about Margaret Chen's predicted fall, I'd called the library to check on her, creating anxiety that caused her to be distracted during her morning walk. When I heard about the house fire, I had driven past the Henderson house several times, and my presence in the neighborhood might have influenced the timing of events that led to the fire. I was terrifying myself by considering the implications, but I was not ready to abandon everything I had discovered. Instead of destroying the recordings as instructed, I decided to pack up my most important equipment and move to a hotel in Kamloops, while I figured out what to do next. But the voices had not been bluffing about taking measures to contain the situation. On my last morning in Lillooet, I woke up to find that every piece of electronic equipment in my house had been destroyed. My mixing board was melted, my computer hard drives were completely wiped, and my field recorders had been reduced to piles of plastic and metal components. The damage was too precise and too complete to have been caused by any natural phenomenon. More disturbing, I discovered that my backup recordings, which I had stored in a fireproof safe, were gone. Not destroyed, but physically removed, as if someone had opened the safe and taken only the specific files related to the mysterious voices. I packed up the rest of my belongings and left Lillooet that same day. I moved back to Vancouver and eventually returned to working in commercial recording studios. But I have never forgotten what I experienced in that tiny mountain town. Sometimes late at night when I am working alone in a studio, I think I hear echoes of those impossible voices speaking their unknowable language. And sometimes, I wonder if the future I'm living now is the same future that was always meant to be, or if my 48 hours in Lillooet somehow changed the course of events in ways I will never fully understand. What I learned is that there are forces in this universe that operate beyond our understanding of time and causality, and that some knowledge is too dangerous for human beings to possess. The ability to hear tomorrow's conversations today might seem like a gift, but it is actually a curse that threatens the very fabric of reality itself. I still have dreams about Talon Creek and the voices that somehow knew everything about my past and everything about our collective future, and I pray that I will never again find myself in a place where the boundaries between yesterday and tomorrow become as thin as the mountain air. I am Constable Dion Baptiste, and the murder of 16-year-old Janae Williams exposed the darkest secrets our isolated northern community had been hiding for decades. What began as a routine investigation into the death of a high school student ended up revealing a conspiracy of corruption and cover-up that reached back generations and involved some of the most respected citizens of Flin Flon, Manitoba. Flin Flon sits right on the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, about 600 kilometers north of Winnipeg. It is a mining town that was built around the massive copper and zinc deposits discovered in the 1920s, and for nearly a century, the mine was the heartbeat that kept the community alive. The population peaked at around 10,000 people in the 1970s, but by 2020, we were down to less than 5,000 residents, most of them older folks who had lived there their entire lives. I had been working as an RCMP constable in Flin Flon for 3 years, when Janae Williams was found dead on the morning of March 15, 2021. She was discovered by a group of teenagers who had been exploring the abandoned buildings around the old Hudson Bay mining and smelting complex that had been shut down the previous year. Janae was lying in what had once been the main equipment storage building, in a room that still contained rusted machinery and coils of old cable. She had been strangled, and her body showed signs that she had fought hard against her attacker. But what was most disturbing about the scene was that she had clearly been placed there deliberately, positioned in a way that suggested her killer wanted her to be found. Janae Williams was a junior at Hapnot Collegiate, the only high school in town. She was a quiet girl who got good grades and stayed out of trouble. She lived with her mother, Patricia Williams, in a small house on the south side of town. Her father had left when she was 7 years old, and Patricia worked 2 jobs to support them both. By all accounts, Janae was a responsible teenager who helped her mother with household expenses by working part-time at the local grocery store. The investigation started routinely. I interviewed Janae's classmates, her teachers, her co-workers, and anyone else who might have information about her activities in the days leading up to her death. Everyone I spoke with described her as a sweet, intelligent girl who kept to herself and did not have any enemies or conflicts with other people. But as I dug deeper into Janae's life, I discovered that she had been working on a project for her Canadian history class that had taken her into some very sensitive territory. Janae's history teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Sanderson, told me that Janae had chosen to research the history of residential schools in northern Manitoba for her final semester project. She had been particularly interested in the Gordon Indian Residential School, which had operated about 30 kilometers south of Flin Flon from 1888 until 1996. Mrs. Sanderson explained that Janae had been spending time at the local library, going through old newspaper archives and government records, trying to document the experiences of Indigenous children who had been forced to attend the residential school. It was sensitive research, but Mrs. Sanderson had encouraged Janae because she felt it was important for students to understand the historical injustices that had occurred in their own region. But according to Mrs. Sanderson, Janae had come to her about 2 weeks before her death, excited about some documents she had discovered that she believed proved there had been a cover-up involving deaths at the residential school. Janae claimed she had found evidence that several children had died at the school under suspicious circumstances, and that local authorities had helped suppress investigations into those deaths. Mrs. Sanderson told me that she had advised Janae to be careful about making accusations without solid evidence. But Janae had been convinced that she was onto something important. She had planned to present her findings as part of her history project at the end of March. I decided to examine the materials Janae had been researching, so I went to the Flin Flon Public Library and spoke with the head librarian, Dorothy McKinnon. Mrs. McKinnon remembered Janet well and confirmed that she had been coming to the library several times per week since January, spending hours in the archives section reviewing old newspapers and government documents. Mrs. McKinnon showed me the materials Janet had been studying. Most of them were standard historical records, but there were several boxes of documents that had been donated to the library by the estate of a former government administrator who had died in 2018. These documents included correspondence between federal officials, local politicians, and administrators at the Gordon Residential School. As I reviewed the documents, I began to understand what had captured Janae's attention. There were several letters from the 1950s and 1960s that discussed concerns about the health and welfare of children at the residential school. But more significantly, there were memos that suggested local officials had been instructed to minimize public attention to problems at the school. One document that particularly caught my attention was a letter dated September 1963, written by Dr. Harold Mason, who had been the town's only doctor at that time. Dr. Mason had written to federal authorities expressing concerns about an unusual number of deaths among children at the residential school over a 2-year period. He had recommended a formal investigation, but according to the correspondence, his recommendation had been rejected by officials in Ottawa. What made this document especially interesting was that Dr. Mason was the grandfather of our current mayor, Robert Mason. The Mason family had been prominent in Flin Flon for 3 generations, and Robert Mason had been mayor for over a decade. I decided to interview Mayor Mason about his grandfather's concerns regarding the residential school. When I called his office to request a meeting, his secretary told me that the mayor was out of town on business and would not be available for several days. But when I drove past his house that evening, I saw his car in the driveway and lights were on inside. The next morning, I tried calling the mayor's office again, but this time I was told that Mayor Mason had instructed his staff to refer all inquiries about historical matters to the town's legal counsel. When I called the legal office, I was told that the town would not be commenting on any issues related to the residential school without a formal written request that would need to be reviewed by the town council. These responses seemed unusually defensive for what should have been a straightforward historical inquiry. I began to suspect that Janae had discovered something that made powerful people in town very uncomfortable. I returned to the library and asked Mrs. McKinnon if she remembered Janae showing particular interest in any specific documents. She told me that Janae had been especially focused on a box of materials that had come from the estate of Thomas Hartley, who had been the town's police chief from 1955 until 1982. When I examined the Hartley documents, I found what I believe Janae had discovered. There were several police reports from the 1960s that documented investigations into deaths of children who had run away from the residential school. But these reports had been marked as closed without resolution, and there were handwritten notes in the margins suggesting that the investigations had been terminated by order of federal authorities. More disturbing were carbon copies of letters that Chief Hartley had sent to federal officials, expressing frustration that he was being prevented from properly investigating these deaths. In one letter from 1967, Hartley wrote that he had evidence suggesting some of the children had been killed, but that he had been ordered to classify their deaths as accidents or natural causes. The final document in the Hartley collection was a letter dated 1979, written by Chief Hartley to his successor. In this letter, Hartley warned that the truth about the residential school deaths would eventually come to light, and that when it did, people in positions of authority would be held accountable for their role in covering up crimes against children. I now believed that Janae had discovered evidence of a decades-old conspiracy to cover up murders at the residential school and that her own murder was connected to her research. But I needed more evidence before I could make accusations against prominent members of the community. I decided to interview Patricia Williams, Janae's mother, more thoroughly about her daughter's research activities. Patricia told me that Janae had been excited about her history project, but that she had also seemed nervous about something in the weeks before her death. According to Patricia, Janae had mentioned that some people in town were not happy about her research into the residential school. She had not provided specific details, but she had told her mother that she felt like she was being watched when she went to the library. Patricia also told me something that made my investigation take a new direction. She said that about a week before Janae's death, Mayor Mason had come to their house and asked to speak with Janae privately. Patricia had not been present for the conversation, but afterward, Janae had seemed upset and had refused to talk about what the mayor had wanted. I realized I needed to confront Mayor Mason directly, regardless of his attempts to avoid speaking with me. I went to his house that evening and insisted on speaking with him about his conversation with Janae Williams. When Mayor Mason finally agreed to meet with me, his demeanor was defensive and evasive. He admitted that he had spoken with Janae about her research project, but he claimed that he had only wanted to offer guidance and historical context. He said he had been concerned that a high school student might misinterpret historical documents without proper understanding of the context. But when I pressed him about specific details, Mayor Mason became increasingly uncomfortable. He claimed that he could not remember exactly what he and Janae had discussed, but he insisted that he had only been trying to help her with her research. I asked Mayor Mason directly if he was aware that his grandfather had documented concerns about deaths at the residential school, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know. His face went pale, and he began stammering about how historical documents could be misleading and how people should not jump to conclusions about events that had occurred decades ago. At that point, I knew that Mayor Mason was involved in covering up whatever Janae had discovered, but I needed evidence that would connect him directly to her murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 2 days after my conversation with Mayor Mason, I received an anonymous phone call from someone who claimed to have information about Janae's death. The caller, who sounded like an elderly man, told me to check the basement of the old town hall building, which had been abandoned since the new municipal offices were built in 2005. I obtained a search warrant and entered the basement of the old town hall with a forensics team from Winnipeg. What we found there was a cache of documents that had apparently been hidden for decades. The documents included the original, unedited police reports from the 1960s investigations, along with photographs and witness statements that had been suppressed. But most significantly, we found a detailed confession letter written by Thomas Hartley shortly before his death in 1998. In this letter, Hartley admitted that he had been pressured by federal officials and local politicians to cover up the murders of at least 7 Indigenous children who had died after running away from the residential school. According to Hartley's confession, the children had not died from exposure or accidents, as the official reports claimed. They had been killed by a group of local men who had been hired to track down runaways and return them to the school. When some of the children resisted, the men had used excessive force, and several children had died from their injuries. Hartley's letter named several people who had been involved in the cover-up, including Harold Mason, Robert Mason's grandfather. It also indicated that the current generation of the Mason family was aware of their grandfather's role in the conspiracy and had been working to keep the truth hidden. The letter explained that Hartley had hidden these documents because he feared for his safety if he revealed the truth while the people involved were still alive. But he had hoped that someday, when enough time had passed, someone would find the documents and ensure that justice was finally served. When confronted with Hartley's confession letter, Mayor Mason broke down and admitted that he had killed Janae Williams. He explained that Janae had discovered not only the historical cover-up, but also evidence that the Mason family had been profiting from federal compensation payments that were supposed to go to residential school survivors. Mayor Mason had been embezzling funds meant for indigenous communities for over a decade, using his position and his family's historical connections to divert money into personal accounts. When Janae threatened to expose both the historical murders and the ongoing financial crimes, Mayor Mason had felt he had no choice but to silence her. Robert Mason was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. His arrest led to a broader investigation that revealed a network of corruption involving several other prominent families in Flin Flon who had been complicit in covering up crimes and stealing money meant for indigenous communities. The case of Janae Williams became a landmark in Canadian legal history, not only because it solved a murder, but because it finally brought justice for the indigenous children who had been killed decades earlier. The federal government established a special commission to investigate all deaths at residential schools in northern Manitoba, and several families received compensation for the murders of their relatives. But for me personally, the case was a reminder that evil can hide behind respectability and authority for generations, waiting for someone brave enough to shine a light into the darkness. Janae Williams was just 16 years old, but she had the courage to seek truth in places where others preferred to maintain silence. Her murder was a tragedy, but her research ensured that the voices of murdered children were finally heard, and that justice, though delayed, was ultimately served. I am Jaelyn Patel, a paranormal investigator, and the case I am about to tell you about in the historic Métis settlement of Batoche, Saskatchewan changed how I understand the connection between historical trauma and supernatural activity. What began as a routine investigation into poltergeist phenomena became something far more significant when I realized that the spirits terrorizing a modern family were the echoes of a tragedy that occurred during one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. I had been working as a paranormal investigator for 8 years when I received a call in October 2023 from Sarah Kalin, a woman who lived with her husband and 2 children in a century-old farmhouse about 15 kilometers from the town of Rostern. Sarah had found my contact information through a paranormal investigation website, and she was desperate for help with what she described as increasingly violent supernatural activity in her home. Sarah explained that her family had been experiencing strange phenomena for several months, but the activity had escalated dramatically in recent weeks. Doors were slamming shut on their own, often with enough force to rattle the windows throughout the house. Objects were being thrown across rooms when nobody was present to move them. The family's 2 children, ages 6 and 9, were waking up with scratches and bruises that had not been there when they went to bed. Most disturbing, Sarah said that she and her husband had been hearing voices speaking in what sounded like French, coming from empty rooms in the middle of the night. The voices sounded angry and desperate, and they seemed to be getting louder and more frequent as time passed. I agreed to visit the Kalin house the following weekend to conduct a preliminary investigation. The property was located in rural Saskatchewan, surrounded by wheat fields and prairie grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The house itself was a 2-story farmhouse built in the early 1900s with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. When I met the Kalin family, I could immediately see the stress that the supernatural activity was causing them. Sarah was exhausted and jumpy, startling at every small sound. Her husband, Michael, was skeptical about paranormal explanations, but admitted that he could not find any rational cause for what was happening in their home. Their children, Emma and Jacob, seemed withdrawn and frightened, and they refused to play alone in any room of the house. I spent the first evening interviewing each family member separately about their experiences. Sarah told me that the activity had started shortly after they moved into the house in March 2020. At first, it had been minor incidents that could be explained as coincidence or imagination. Doors that they were certain they had closed would be found standing open. Items would be moved from where they had been placed, usually to locations that seemed deliberately inconvenient or unsafe. But by summer, the activity had become more aggressive. Sarah described an incident in July when she had been preparing dinner in the kitchen and had turned around to find that every cabinet door and drawer was standing open, even though she had not touched them. Another time, she had been folding laundry in the living room when a heavy wooden chair had been hurled across the room, missing her by inches. Michael was more reluctant to discuss his experiences, but eventually he admitted that he had heard the French voices on several occasions. He had grown up in Saskatchewan and had studied French in school, so he could understand some of what was being said. According to Michael, the voices seemed to be having arguments, with multiple people shouting at each other about land, betrayal, and death. The children's experiences were the most disturbing. Both Emma and Jacob reported seeing people in their bedrooms at night, shadowy figures who would stand at the foot of their beds or sit in the corners of their rooms. The figures appeared to be adults, both men and women, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The children said that the figures looked sad and angry, and that they would sometimes reach out toward them as if trying to communicate. I set up my investigation equipment throughout the house that first night. I positioned digital recorders in each room to capture any unexplained sounds or voices. I installed motion-activated cameras in the hallways and common areas. I placed electromagnetic field detectors in locations where the family had reported the most activity. Around 2:30 in the morning, my equipment began recording activity. The EMF detectors in the kitchen and dining room registered sudden spikes in electromagnetic energy that lasted for several minutes. The motion cameras captured footage of doors opening and closing on their own. Most significantly, the digital recorders captured clear audio of multiple voices speaking in French. I reviewed the audio recordings the next morning and confirmed that the voices were indeed speaking French, specifically what sounded like an older dialect of French that might have been common in the late 1800s. The voices seemed to be engaged in heated discussions with frequent references to notre terre, our land, les soldats, the soldiers, and justice, justice. Based on the French language and the historical references, I began to suspect that the supernatural activity might be connected to the Métis people who had lived in the region during the late 19th century. I knew that Batoche had been the site of significant historical events during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, but I needed to research the specific history of the land where the Jaelyn house was located. I contacted Dr. Marie Dubois, a historian at the University of Saskatchewan who specialized in Métis history and the Northwest Rebellion. Dr. Dubois was familiar with the area where the Jaelyn house was located, and she provided me with information that completely changed my understanding of what was happening there. According to Dr. Dubois, the Jaelyn house had been built on land that was originally part of a Métis farm belonging to the Bélinger family. François and Marie-Claire Bélinger had established their homestead there in 1882, along with their 4 children and François' elderly parents. The Bélingers were part of the Métis community that had settled in the Saskatchewan Valley under the leadership of Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. In 1885, during the Northwest Rebellion, the Canadian government had sent military forces to suppress the Métis resistance. The Bélingers had supported Riel's provisional government, and their farm had been used as a meeting place and supply depot for Métis fighters. According to historical records that Dr. Dubois had researched, the Bélinger family had been killed when government forces attacked their homestead on May 20th, 1885, just 8 days after the fall of Batoche. The attack on the Bélinger farm had not been officially documented by the Canadian military, and the deaths of the family members had been covered up to avoid drawing attention to what was essentially the execution of non-combatant civilians. The government had wanted to portray the suppression of the rebellion as a legitimate military action against armed insurgents, not as a campaign of extermination against Métis families. Dr. Dubois told me that, according to oral traditions preserved by the surviving Métis community, the Bélanger family had been given no opportunity to surrender. The soldiers had surrounded the house at dawn, set it on fire, and shot anyone who tried to escape the flames. François, Marie-Claire, their 4 children, and François' parents had all perished in the attack. After the rebellion was suppressed, the Canadian government had confiscated Métis lands and redistributed them to European settlers. The Bélanger farm had eventually been sold to a homesteader from Ontario, who had built a new house on the foundation of the original Métis home. That new house had been rebuilt and expanded several times over the decades, but it was essentially the same structure where the Jaelyn family now lived. Armed with this historical information, I returned to the Jaelyn house to conduct a more focused investigation. This time, I brought Dr. Dubois with me, along with Joseph Parenteau, a Métis elder from the local community who had knowledge of traditional spiritual practices and the oral history of the 1885 rebellion. Mr. Parenteau listened to the recordings I had made of the French voices, and he confirmed that they were speaking in the Michif dialect that had been common among the Saskatchewan Métis in the 1880s. More significantly, he recognized some of the phrases and references that appeared in the recordings. The voices were talking about their land being stolen, their children being murdered, and their need for justice and proper burial. According to Mr. Parenteau, the Bélanger family had never received proper funeral rites according to Métis tradition. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves, and their spirits had been unable to find peace because their deaths had never been acknowledged or mourned by their community. The supernatural activity in the Jaelyn house was the manifestation of their anger and their desperate need for recognition and justice. Mr. Parenteau explained that in Métis spiritual tradition, people who died violently or unjustly could become trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. These spirits would continue to inhabit the places where they had lived and died until their grievances were addressed, and they were given proper spiritual guidance to move on to the afterlife. He offered to conduct a traditional Métis ceremony to help the Bélanger family find peace, but he warned that such ceremonies were complex and required the participation of the entire community. The spirits needed to know that their story was remembered, that their deaths were acknowledged as unjust, and that their descendants honored their sacrifice. Over the following weeks, Mr. Parenteau worked with other elders from the local Métis community to organize a memorial ceremony for the Bélanger family. They researched genealogical records to identify living descendants of the family, and they contacted Métis organizations across Saskatchewan to spread awareness of the planned ceremony. The memorial ceremony took place on a cold November morning, exactly 135 years after the Bélanger family had been killed. More than 50 people participated, including Métis community members, local historians, and representatives from Indigenous rights organizations. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Michif, and it included traditional prayers, songs, and offerings. During the ceremony, Mr. Parenteau and the other elders acknowledged the injustice of the Bélanger family's deaths and formally mourned their passing according to Métis tradition. They blessed the land where the family had lived and died, and they asked the spirits to accept the community's prayers and find peace in the afterlife. The supernatural activity in the Jaelyn house stopped immediately after the ceremony. The family reported no more unexplained voices, no more objects being thrown, and no more frightening apparitions in the children's bedrooms. The electromagnetic disturbances that my equipment had been detecting disappeared completely, but the case had a profound impact that extended far beyond the resolution of a single haunting. The research that Dr. Dubois had conducted into the Bélanger family murders led to broader academic investigation into undocumented atrocities committed against Métis families during the 1885 rebellion. Several other Cases of unreported killings were discovered in military and government archives, and these findings contributed to the growing recognition of the genocide that had been committed against Indigenous peoples in Canada. The Jaelyn family decided to remain in their house, but they worked with the local Métis community to install a memorial plaque honoring the Bélanger family. They also established a small scholarship fund to support Métis students studying Canadian history, ensuring that the story of families like the Bélangers would not be forgotten. For me personally, the investigation changed how I approach paranormal cases involving historical properties. I learned that supernatural phenomena are often rooted in unresolved historical trauma, and that the most effective way to address hauntings is frequently through historical research, community engagement, and restorative justice rather than traditional exorcism or cleansing rituals. The Bélanger family had not been malicious spirits trying to harm the Jaelyn family. They had been the victims of historical injustice who needed their story to be told and their deaths to be mourned. Once the community acknowledged their suffering and honored their memory, they were able to find the peace that had been denied to them for more than a century. The case taught me that the boundary between historical investigation and paranormal investigation is often much thinner than we realize. The ghosts that haunt our buildings are frequently the echoes of real people who suffered real injustices, and helping them find peace requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our shared history. Today, the Jaelyn house sits peacefully in the Saskatchewan prairie, no longer troubled by supernatural activity. But the memorial plaque in the front yard ensures that visitors remember the Métis family who lived and died there, and whose story might have been lost forever if not for their desperate attempts to make their voices heard from beyond the grave. The case also reinforced my belief that paranormal investigation is ultimately about human dignity and historical truth. When we investigate claims of supernatural activity, we are often uncovering stories of people who have been forgotten, marginalized, or deliberately erased from official historical records. Our responsibility as investigators is not just to document unexplained phenomena, but to ensure that the human stories behind those phenomena are preserved and honored. The spirits of François and Marie-Claire Bélanger, their children, and François' parents are now at rest, but their story serves as a reminder that the violence and injustice of the past can echo through generations until truth and acknowledgement finally provide resolution. In helping them find peace, we also help ourselves understand the full complexity of our shared history and our ongoing responsibility to honor the memory of those who came before us. My name is Jaelyn Blackfeather, and I am a search and rescue coordinator for coastal British Columbia. What happened in our community of Alert Bay over 3 months in 2021 defied every protocol and explanation we had developed during my 15 years of coordinating rescue operations in some of the most dangerous terrain in Canada. 7 people disappeared from our remote island community over 12 weeks. All of them experienced outdoors people who knew the terrain like the back of their hands. No bodies were found. No logical explanation emerged, but witnesses reported seeing the missing people in impossible locations. Alert Bay sits on Cormorant Island, about 280 kilometers northwest of Vancouver, accessible only by ferry or small aircraft. The community has a population of just over 500 people, most of them members of the Namgis First Nation, with some non-Indigenous families who have lived there for generations. It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where people look out for each other, and where the disappearance of even one person sends shockwaves through the entire community. The vanishings began in early June 2021 with the disappearance of Thomas Matilpe, a 53-year-old fishing guide who had been born and raised on the island. Thomas was one of those people who could navigate the waters around Alert Bay in his sleep, and he knew every trail, every beach and every hidden cove within a 50-kilometer radius. He had been scheduled to take a group of tourists whale watching on June 7th, but he never returned to the harbor that evening. The search for Thomas began immediately. We deployed boats, helicopters, and ground teams to cover every possible area where he might have encountered trouble. The weather had been perfect that day, with calm seas and clear skies, so we could not attribute his disappearance to dangerous conditions. His boat was found the following morning, anchored in a sheltered bay about 10 kilometers south of Alert Bay. The boat was undamaged, the engine was in perfect working order, and all of Thomas's safety equipment was still on board. What was strange about finding the boat was that Thomas was not the kind of person to abandon his vessel and swim to shore. He had been working as a guide for over 20 years, and safety was his top priority. Even if he had encountered some kind of emergency on land, he would have radioed for help or at least left some indication of where he was going. We searched for Thomas for 8 days, covering hundreds of square kilometers of forest, coastline, and ocean. We brought in specialized teams with cadaver dogs and underwater search equipment. The Canadian Armed Forces provided helicopter support and infrared scanning technology, but we found no trace of Thomas Matilpe anywhere. The second disappearance occurred 3 weeks later, on June 29th. Sarah Hunt, a 31-year-old park ranger who worked for BC Parks, failed to return from a routine patrol of the ecological reserve on the north end of the island. Sarah was an experienced hiker and backcountry specialist who carried GPS equipment, satellite communication devices, and emergency supplies whenever she went into the field. Like Thomas, Sarah simply vanished without leaving any trace of what had happened to her. Her backpack was found the following morning, sitting on a fallen log beside one of the main trails. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. All of her equipment was still in the pack, including her radio, her GPS unit, and her emergency beacon, none of which had been activated. The discovery of Sarah's abandoned backpack was particularly troubling because it suggested that whatever had happened to her had occurred suddenly, without giving her time to call for help or even reach for her emergency equipment. But there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of an animal attack, and no indication that she had been injured or fallen. By this point, the community was becoming seriously concerned. 2 experienced outdoors people had vanished under identical circumstances within 3 weeks of each other. The RCMP had opened an investigation, but they were as baffled as the rest of us. There was no evidence of foul play, no suspicious individuals in the area, and no logical explanation for how 2 people could simply disappear in such a small, well-traveled region. The third disappearance occurred on July 15th. Michael Dennis, a 47-year-old logger who had worked in the coastal forests for over 25 years, disappeared while conducting a timber survey on the mainland, about 15 kilometers east of Alert Bay. Michael's colleagues found his surveying equipment arranged neatly on a tree stump, but Michael himself was gone. What made Michael's disappearance particularly unsettling was that his co-workers reported seeing him only minutes before they discovered his abandoned equipment. According to their statements, Michael had been working in a section of forest that was completely surrounded by thick underbrush and fallen logs. The only way in or out of the area was through a narrow corridor that his colleagues had been monitoring, or yet somehow Michael had vanished from an area that should have been impossible to leave undetected. The fourth disappearance occurred on August 2nd. Lisa Paul, a 28-year-old marine biologist who was conducting research on orca populations, disappeared while kayaking near Malcolm Island. Lisa was an expert kayaker who had been working in the waters around Alert Bay for 3 years. She knew the tides, the currents, and the weather patterns better than most commercial fishermen. Lisa's kayak was found floating empty in Blackfish Sound the following morning. Like the previous disappearances, there was no evidence of an accident or emergency. Her personal flotation device was still in the kayak, along with her research, equipment, and emergency supplies. The kayak showed no signs of damage, and weather conditions had been calm throughout the day she disappeared. By August, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 4 experienced, capable people had vanished under nearly identical circumstances over the course of 2 months. Each disappearance had occurred during daylight hours, in good weather, in areas that the missing persons knew well. In each case, their equipment had been found abandoned but undamaged, suggesting that they had left their gear behind voluntarily or had been removed from the scene so quickly that they had no time to gather their belongings. The RCMP brought in additional investigators from Vancouver, including specialists in missing persons cases and criminal profilers. They established a command center in Alert Bay and conducted extensive interviews with everyone who had been in contact with the missing persons. But the investigation produced no new leads or explanations. The 5th disappearance occurred on August 20th. David Wilson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who had moved to Alert Bay 5 years earlier, disappeared while hiking alone on one of the island's interior trails. David was found of walking and had explored virtually every accessible area of Cormorant Island multiple times. He was methodical and cautious, always informing his neighbors of his hiking plans and expected return time. David's walking stick was found propped against a large cedar tree beside the main trail, but there was no sign of David anywhere in the vicinity. Search teams spent 4 days combing the area, but they found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, and no other evidence of where David might have gone. The 6th disappearance occurred on September 8th. Jennifer Martinez, a 35-year-old nurse who worked at the local health center, disappeared while picking berries in a well-known area about 2 kilometers from the village center. Jennifer had been berry picking in the same location every summer for over a decade, and she knew the terrain intimately. Jennifer's berry bucket was found sitting upright beneath a patch of salmonberry bushes, still partially filled with the berries she had been picking. But Jennifer had vanished as completely as the others. The berry bucket's placement was particularly puzzling because it suggested that Jennifer had been in the process of picking berries when she disappeared. Yet she had somehow vanished without disturbing the bucket or spilling its contents. The 7th and final disappearance occurred on September 26th. Robert Charlie, a 44-year-old commercial fisherman and member of the Namgis First Nation, disappeared while checking his crab traps near Hansen Island. Robert was one of the most experienced fishermen in the community, with intimate knowledge of the local waters dating back to his childhood. Robert's fishing boat was found anchored near his trap lines, with the engine still running and his radio turned on. One of his crab traps had been pulled up and was sitting on the deck of the boat, but Robert was nowhere to be found. The trap was empty, and there was no indication of what might have prompted Robert to abandon his boat while it was still running. By this point, the community was in a state of panic. 7 people had vanished over a period of less than 4 months, and we were no closer to understanding what was happening than we had been after the first disappearance. Theories ranged from serial killer to human trafficking ring to some kind of natural phenomenon that we did not understand. But then, in early October, we began receiving reports that were even more disturbing than the disappearances themselves. Elizabeth Hunt, Sarah Hunt's sister, reported seeing Sarah walking along the shoreline near Ecological Reserve. According to Elizabeth, Sarah looked normal and healthy, but when Elizabeth called out to her, Sarah did not respond or acknowledge her presence in any way. Elizabeth followed Sarah for several minutes, but when she rounded a bend in the shoreline, Sarah was gone, even though there was nowhere she could have gone without Elizabeth seeing her. 2 days later, Margaret Dennis reported seeing her brother Michael working in a section of forest near his usual logging site. Margaret drove to the location to talk to Michael, but when she arrived, there was no one there and no evidence that anyone had been working in the area recently. Over the following weeks, similar sightings were reported by other community members. Thomas Matilpe was seen working on his boat in the harbor, but when people approached the dock, the boat was empty, and there was no sign of Thomas anywhere nearby. Lisa Paul was spotted kayaking near Malcolm Island, but when other boaters went to investigate, they found nothing but empty water. The sightings were always brief and always ended the same way. The missing person would be visible for a few minutes, appearing to be engaged in normal activities, but they would never respond to people who tried to communicate with them, and they would always vanish before anyone could get close enough to make physical contact. The RCMP initially dismissed the sightings as wishful thinking or psychological responses to trauma and stress, but as the reports continued and became more detailed, investigators began to take them seriously. Multiple witnesses were describing consistent behaviors and locations, and some of the sightings had occurred in places that the witnesses could not have known the missing persons had frequented. In November, I made the decision to organize one final comprehensive search effort that would focus on the locations where the missing persons had been sighted, rather than the areas where their belongings had been found. The search would involve the entire community, including indigenous elders who had traditional knowledge of the island that might not be available through conventional sources. Elder Mary Wilson, who was 93 years old and had lived on Cormorant Island her entire life, provided information that completely changed our understanding of what might be happening. According to Elder Wilson, there were locations on the island that had been considered spiritually significant by the Namgis people for generations, places where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was believed to be thin. Elder Wilson told me that according to traditional stories, people could sometimes become lost between worlds at these locations, existing in a state where they were neither fully alive nor fully dead. These people would continue to appear in places that had been important to them in life, but they would be unable to communicate with the living or return to their normal existence. She explained that such occurrences were rare and usually happened only during times of great spiritual disturbance or when the natural balance of the island had been disrupted in some way. Elder Wilson suggested that the recent increase in development and tourism might have disturbed ancient spiritual sites, creating the conditions that allowed people to become trapped between worlds. Based on Elder Wilson's guidance, we focused our final search effort on a series of caves and underground passages on the north end of the island that had been considered sacred by the Namgis people. These locations had never been thoroughly explored by search teams because they were difficult to access and were not areas where missing persons would normally be expected to go. On November 15th, after 3 days of careful exploration, we found them. All 7 missing persons were discovered in a large underground chamber that could only be accessed through a narrow passage that required crawling for nearly 50 meters through solid rock. The chamber itself was enormous, probably created by water erosion over thousands of years, with a high ceiling and smooth stone walls that seemed to glow with an inner light. The 7 missing persons were sitting in a circle in the center of the chamber, facing each other but not speaking or moving. Their eyes were open, and they appeared to be breathing normally, but they were completely unresponsive to our attempts to communicate with them. They looked exactly as they had when they disappeared, with no signs of injury, malnutrition, or exposure to the elements. Most remarkably, they had no memory of the time they had spent missing. When we finally managed to move them out of the chamber and back to the surface, they were confused and disoriented, but they believed that only a few minutes had passed since they had been engaged in their normal activities. Thomas thought he was still guiding tourists. Sarah believed she was still conducting her patrol, and the others retained similar memories of their last conscious moments. Medical examinations revealed that all 7 were in perfect health, with no signs that they had spent months without food, water, or medical care. Their clothing was clean and undamaged, and they showed no effects of prolonged exposure to underground conditions. However, all 7 reported having vivid dreams during their time in the chamber. They described shared visions of the island's history, including events that had occurred centuries before European contact. They had experienced the perspective of Namgis ancestors, witnessed spiritual ceremonies, and gained knowledge of traditional practices that had been lost for generations. Elder Wilson explained that the missing persons had been chosen to serve as guardians of traditional knowledge, and that their experience in the chamber had been a form of spiritual education rather than an imprisonment. According to her interpretation, they had been taught to preserve and share the cultural wisdom of the Namgis people, and their return to the community was a sign that this knowledge was ready to be revealed. The 7 individuals have all resumed their normal lives, but they have also become important cultural resources for the Namgis nation. Their shared knowledge has helped the community recover traditional practices, understand historical events, and strengthen their connection to the spiritual aspects of their ancestral territory. The underground chamber has been sealed and is now protected as a sacred site by the Namgis nation. The disappearances stopped completely after the 7 people were returned to the surface, suggesting that whatever spiritual process had been taking place was now complete. As a search and rescue coordinator, I learned that there are some mysteries that cannot be solved through conventional methods or scientific analysis. The Jaelyn Valley vanishings taught me that the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world is not as clear as I had always assumed, and that some missing persons cases require traditional knowledge and cultural understanding rather than modern technology and investigative techniques. The experience also reinforced the importance of working with indigenous communities and respecting their traditional knowledge when conducting search and rescue operations in their ancestral territories. The solutions to some problems can only be found by understanding the deep spiritual and cultural connections between people and the land where they live. Today, Alert Bay remains a peaceful and safe community, but the events of 2021 have left a lasting impact on all of us who experience them. We have gained a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that still exist in our world, and we have learned to approach the unknown with humility and respect rather than skepticism and dismissal. I am retired RCMP Sergeant, and the case that ended my career involved a string of murders at a roadside motel that exposed a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of our small city's government. After 32 years of police work across Alberta, I thought I had seen every kind of crime and corruption that human beings could devise. But what I discovered during the investigation into the deaths at the Desert Rose Motel in Medicine Hat revealed a network of criminal activity so extensive and so deeply embedded in our community's power structure that it ultimately cost me my job, my pension, and my faith in the justice system I had spent my life serving. Medicine Hat sits in the heart of southeastern Alberta, about 300 kilometers southeast of Calgary, and it has always been a city built on resource extraction. Natural gas, oil, and agriculture have driven the local economy for over a century, creating a small but wealthy elite that controls most of the significant business and political activity in the region. The city has a population of about 60,000 people, large enough to have real political influence, but small enough that everyone in positions of power knows everyone else. The Desert Rose Motel was located on the Trans-Canada Highway, just outside the city limits, and it catered to transient workers who came to the area for temporary employment in the oil fields, construction projects, and seasonal agricultural work. It was not the kind of place that tourists or business travelers would choose to stay, but it served an important function for the people at the bottom of the economic ladder who needed cheap, temporary accommodation. The first body was discovered on March 8, 2019, by the motel's cleaning staff. The victim was identified as Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old man from Nova Scotia who had come to Alberta looking for work in the oil industry. He had been staying at the Desert Rose for 3 weeks while applying for jobs at various drilling companies in the area. Marcus was found dead in his room, lying on his bed fully clothed, with no apparent signs of violence or struggle. The initial assessment by the attending coroner suggested that he had died of natural causes, possibly a heart attack or drug overdose. But when the toxicology results came back 2 weeks later, they showed no evidence of drugs or alcohol in his system, and the autopsy revealed no underlying health conditions that could have caused his death. The case was classified as death by unknown causes and filed away, but something about it bothered me. Marcus had been a healthy man in his 30s with no history of medical problems, and there was no explanation for why he would have died suddenly in his sleep. I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation into his background and activities in the days leading up to his death. I discovered that Marcus had been working odd jobs around the city while waiting for a permanent position to open up. He had been employed by several temporary labor agencies, doing construction work, warehouse loading, and general maintenance for various local businesses. According to the people I interviewed, Marcus had been optimistic about his prospects and had been planning to bring his wife and children to Alberta once he found steady employment. But I also learned that Marcus had been asking questions about some of the work sites where he had been assigned. According to his roommate at the Desert Rose, Marcus had mentioned that he had seen things at construction sites that did not seem legitimate. He had observed materials being delivered to job sites that did not match the official project specifications, and he had noticed that some of the work being done did not correspond to the building permits that were supposed to be on file with the city. Marcus had been particularly concerned about a large construction project on the north side of Medicine Hat, where a new community center was supposed to be built with funding from the federal government. According to his roommate, Marcus had said that the foundation work being done at the site was much more extensive than what would be needed for a community center, and that some of the materials being used were industrial-grade equipment that seemed out of place for the project. The second death occurred 6 weeks later, on April 19th. The victim was Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old woman from Manitoba, who had been working as a housekeeper for several local businesses. Like Marcus, she was found dead in her room at the Desert Rose Motel with no apparent cause of death. Jennifer's autopsy results were identical to Marcus's. No drugs, no alcohol, no underlying health conditions, and no signs of violence or trauma. But when I interviewed people who had known Jennifer, I learned that she had also been asking questions about irregularities she had observed in her work. Jennifer had been employed by a cleaning service that provided housekeeping for several city government buildings, including City Hall and the municipal offices. According to her supervisor, Jennifer had mentioned that she had found documents in trash cans and recycling bins that suggested city officials were involved in financial dealings that did not appear to be legitimate government business. Jennifer had been particularly interested in documents related to federal infrastructure funding that was supposed to be used for projects benefiting indigenous communities in the region. She had found correspondence suggesting that some of this funding was being diverted to projects that would primarily benefit non-indigenous developers and business owners. The third death occurred on May 27th. Robert Hayes, a 41-year-old electrician from British Columbia, was found dead in his room under the same mysterious circumstances as the previous victims. Robert had been working on electrical installations for various construction projects around Medicine Hat, and like the others, he had been asking questions about things he had observed that seemed suspicious. By this point, I was convinced that the deaths were connected and that they were not natural. 3 healthy adults dying under identical circumstances in the same location over a period of 3 months was not a coincidence. I began investigating more aggressively, focusing on what the victims might have discovered that could have made them targets for murder. I submitted a formal request to my supervisors for authorization to treat the deaths as potential homicides and to expand the investigation to include the construction projects and government contracts that the victims had been questioning, but my request was denied. I was told that there was no evidence of foul play and that the investigation was a waste of resources. The fourth death occurred on June 15th. Patricia Morris, 53-year-old bookkeeper from Saskatchewan, was found dead in her room at the Desert Rose. Patricia had been working temporary assignments for several local businesses, helping them prepare financial records for audits and tax filings. When I interviewed Patricia's colleagues, I learned that she had discovered significant discrepancies in the financial records of several companies that were involved in government contracts. Patricia had told her supervisor that she believed some of these companies were engaging in fraud, inflating their costs and billing the government for work that was never actually performed. More significantly, Patricia had identified a pattern suggesting that several supposedly independent companies were actually controlled by the same group of investors, and that they were coordinating their bids to ensure that government contracts were awarded to members of their network at artificially high prices. I made another formal request to expand the investigation, this time including Patricia's findings about the financial fraud. Again, my request was denied, and I was warned that continued pursuit of unfounded conspiracy theories could result in disciplinary action against me. The fifth death occurred on July 9th. William Chen, a 62-year-old accountant from Ontario, was found dead in his room under the same circumstances as the previous victims. William had been reviewing financial records for a federal audit of infrastructure spending in the Medicine Hat region, and he had identified serious irregularities in how government funds were being allocated and spent. At this point, I realized that my own department was compromised. The pattern of deaths was obvious, the connection to government corruption was clear, and yet my supervisors were actively preventing me from investigating. I began to suspect that members of the RCMP leadership in Medicine Hat were involved in the conspiracy that was being covered up. I decided to conduct my own investigation outside of official channels. Using my own resources and working during my off-duty hours, I began gathering evidence about the construction projects, government contracts, and financial dealings that the victims had been investigating. What I discovered was a massive fraud scheme involving federal infrastructure funding that was supposed to be used for projects benefiting Indigenous communities in southern Alberta. Over a period of several years, millions of dollars in federal funding had been diverted to projects that primarily benefited a network of non-Indigenous developers, construction companies, and local politicians. The scheme worked by creating fake Indigenous development corporations that would apply for federal funding for community projects like housing, schools, and community centers. Once the funding was approved, the projects would be subcontracted to companies owned by the same people who controlled the fake Indigenous corporations. The projects would then be completed using substandard materials and methods, with the excess funding being diverted to personal accounts. In some cases, projects were never completed at all, with the funding simply disappearing into shell companies and offshore accounts. In other cases, projects that were supposed to benefit Indigenous communities were actually built in non-Indigenous areas and used for commercial development that generated profits for the conspirators. The conspiracy involved several prominent business leaders in Medicine Hat, including the mayor, 2 city councilors, the city manager, and the police chief. It also included several officers in my own detachment who had been tasked with investigating complaints about the fraudulent projects, but had systematically suppressed those investigations. The 6th death occurred on August 3rd. David Blackhorse, a 47-year-old member of the Siksika First Nation, was found dead in his room at the Desert Rose. David had been working as a liaison between Indigenous communities and government agencies, helping to oversee the federal infrastructure projects that were being defrauded by the conspiracy. David's death was particularly significant because he had been preparing a comprehensive report on the missing infrastructure funding that would have exposed the entire scheme. According to his colleagues, David had documented evidence of the fraud dating back over 5 years, and he had been preparing to present his findings to federal authorities. I knew that David's death was not natural, and I also knew that I was running out of time. If the conspirators were willing to kill 6 people to protect their scheme, they would not hesitate to kill a police officer who was threatening to expose them. I made copies of all the evidence I had gathered and sent them to the RCMP headquarters in Ottawa, along with a detailed report explaining the connection between the deaths at the Desert Rose Motel and the infrastructure funding fraud. I also sent copies to several journalists and to Indigenous rights organizations that had been advocating for accountability in government spending. 3 days after I submitted my report, I was called into a meeting with my district commander and informed that I was being suspended from duty pending an internal investigation into allegations of misconduct. The allegations were vague and appeared to be fabricated, but the suspension effectively prevented me from continuing my investigation or accessing any official resources. The 7th and final death occurred on August 28th. Maria Santos, a 39-year-old journalist from Calgary, was found dead in her room at the Desert Rose. Maria had been investigating the infrastructure funding fraud based on information I had provided to her, and she had been preparing a series of articles that would have exposed the conspiracy to public scrutiny. Maria's death finally attracted attention from outside the Medicine Hat region. Her newspaper contacted the RCMP headquarters in Ottawa and demanded a full investigation into what they characterized as the systematic murder of people who were investigating government corruption. A special investigation team was sent from Ottawa to take over the case. Within 2 weeks, they had arrested the mayor of Medicine Hat, the police chief, 3 city councilors, the city manager, and 12 other individuals involved in the conspiracy. The investigation revealed that the fraud scheme had stolen over $40 million in federal funding over a period of 8 years. But the arrests came too late for me personally. The internal investigation into my conduct had been manipulated to make it appear that I had been conducting unauthorized investigations and sharing confidential information with unauthorized parties. I was forced to resign from the RCMP and forfeit my pension, even though the special investigation team later confirmed that all of my findings had been accurate and that my actions had been essential to exposing the conspiracy. The trial of the conspirators began in 2021 and resulted in convictions for all of the major participants. The mayor was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The police chief received 10 years, and the others received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. The federal government established a compensation fund for the Indigenous communities that had been defrauded, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar schemes in the future. But 7 people had died to protect a conspiracy that was ultimately exposed anyway, and the people responsible for their murders were never charged with homicide. The official cause of death for all 7 victims remains listed as unknown, even though the special investigation team confirmed that they had all been murdered using an undetectable poison that had been administered through their food or water. The Desert Rose Motel was demolished in 2022, but I still drive past the empty lot sometimes and think about Marcus Thompson, Jennifer Walsh, Robert Hayes, Patricia Morris, William Chen, David Blackhorse, and Maria Santos. They were ordinary people who died because they had the courage to ask questions about corruption and injustice, and they deserve to be remembered as heroes rather than victims. The case taught me that corruption can exist at every level of government and law enforcement, and that the people who are supposed to protect the public can sometimes be the same people who are exploiting and harming vulnerable communities. It also taught me that speaking truth to power always comes with a cost, but that the cost of remaining silent can be much higher. I live on a small pension now, working part-time as a security guard, but I have no regrets about the choices I made. The 7 people who died at the Desert Rose Motel finally received justice, and the Indigenous communities that were defrauded received compensation for what was stolen from them. Sometimes that has to be enough, even when the personal cost of doing the right thing is higher than anyone should have to pay. The Medicine Hat infrastructure fraud case became one of the largest corruption scandals in Canadian history, but it also demonstrated that even the most powerful conspiracies can be brought down when ordinary people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. The victims at the Desert Rose Motel did not die in vain, and their courage in seeking truth ultimately led to justice for the communities that had been exploited and harmed by those who were supposed to serve and protect them.